It's a real great pleasure to introduce Rory Dickson. His full name is William Rory Dickson, but we're told that really the William, which is the first name, should be the middle name, and the Rory, which is the second name, is the first name. So we'll call you Rory if that's okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Rory was born and raised in Calgary, in Alberta, in Canada, and came to Islam and Sufism in his late teens. And he did a joint PhD in Ontario, in Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo, specializing in Islamic studies. He, in other words, pursued a study of Sufism while at the same time maintaining a very broad interest in contemplative traditions of various kinds. He was then a doctoral fellow and attended the University of Toronto, and then spent time at the University of Copenhagen's research school in Damascus, in Syria. His research basically combines a focus on contemporary Islam in general and on Islamic mysticism or Sufism in particular. He's got 4 books, including the new one. First one will tell you a little bit about his background, because it was called Living Sufism in North America, Between Tradition and Transformation. And it was an exploration, really, of the way in which North American Sufi groups negotiate Sufism's changing relation to Islam, to Islamic orthodoxy, to authority, to gender, many other issues. He's also co-authored an introduction to Sufism with Mina Sherifi Funk called Unveiling Sufism from Manhattan to Mecca, and also an overview of Sufism in the modern period called Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture. So we're here to discuss his latest book, Dissolving into Being, The Wisdom of Sufi Philosophy, which I'm pleased to say we were able to bring out recently. And it offers an introduction to Sufi philosophy, in inverted commas, maybe one should put that, and a modern commentary on chapters from Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-hikam, or the Gemstones of Wisdom. So first of all, Rory, welcome, and lovely to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Maybe you can begin by giving us a brief summary of the book, especially for people who haven't yet been able to read it, and just a kind of flavor of it, maybe read a passage or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, so I maybe I'll start by just saying that the book grew out of a sense of kind of an absence that I sensed when it was actually my brother, who is a software engineer in the United States. He's based in the Pacific Northwest and had been in recent years getting into things like mindfulness and meditation, and even started dabbling a bit in Buddhist philosophy, and of course knew what I do for work, and asked, what might I recommend for him to read on Sufi philosophy? And I thought, okay, that's an interesting question, because there are some amazing books in print in the English language, many from Anqa, dealing with issues related to Sufi philosophy and really the school of Ibn Arabi. But they're often quite technical works, translations of classical texts, and I think that a specialist background can be really helpful in accessing those. And I wasn't sure that those would be the right fit, translations of the Futuhat or something like that. I thought, well, that might not be the place to start. And at the same time, I think, well, there are these books out there on intros to Sufism that are accessible, but really don't get into the philosophical roots or bases of the Sufi tradition. So that was really where the book began, is when I felt this sense of, I think maybe there's room then to try to write an introduction to Sufi philosophy that is at least somewhat accessible for folks without a background in Islamic studies or any kind of specialty in that area. And basically then after that, I started working through the Fusus, the Gemstones of Wisdom. And this was related to a Sufi book club that we started here in Winnipeg a few years ago, and I'll maybe mention that a little bit later. But when I started going through those chapters, I think somewhat organically started drawing out passages that I thought could be discussed at length in a contemporary way, put into conversation with other philosophical, mystical, so-called traditions, and that might offer then something a bit more accessible for somebody like my brother who reads in areas related to spirituality and philosophy broadly, but again doesn't necessarily have a background in Islamic traditions. So that was really the genesis of the book. And then basically I started to hone in on 8 chapters in particular from the Gemstones of Wisdom. I liked the idea of a kind of octave of chapters and thought that I would choose select passages that really opened up to a larger conversation, a larger commentary. And so I would choose passages from each of these chapters and then kind of unpack those with reference to Islamic Sufi traditions more broadly, but also contemporary philosophical traditions and even other mystical traditions. I realize that the book kind of does a bit of comparative mysticism, which I feel like is something that has gone out of fashion since perhaps the 60s and 70s, but I do think there's real value in looking at these rich spiritual traditions next to one another and drawing out some shared themes. So yeah, the purpose of the book then is really to communicate some of the core ideas of Sufi philosophy in a way that's accessible to the non-specialist in particular, to put this philosophy into conversation with other mystical philosophical traditions, we might say, and contemporary thought. And then finally, I think I wanted the book to also be a bit of a doorway onto the Islamic Sufi tradition as a whole. So I also see it as something that can function as an introduction to Sufism. And I was mentioning earlier to Stephen that I'm teaching a seminar next semester on Sufism, and I'll be assigning the book. And so I see it has a purpose in that respect as well. I think especially today, really in recent decades, but for quite some time, definitely in what we might call the West, there are a lot of stereotypes, quite negative stereotypes about the Islamic tradition, and often a very shallow sense of what this tradition offers humanity. And so I think there's real value as well in finding ways to draw out some of this incredibly sophisticated and powerful mystical philosophical tradition from within Islam and help make that a little bit more, again, accessible for people. So I think that was kind of the broad purpose or purposes of the book overall.
Lovely. And you mentioned the Sufi book club in Winnipeg. That sounds like an unusual kind of venue. Can you say a little bit more about it and how it operated?
Yeah, so that was really, again, something that proved to, I think, help, I guess you could say, gestate this book. And really what happened about a year after I moved to Winnipeg, so I came here to work at the University of Winnipeg in 2015. And about a year after that, I was invited to join a Muslim-Jewish dialogue group in the city. And I thought that sounded great and started attending those meetings. And some folks there, both Muslim and Jewish backgrounds, said, "Oh, so you're doing work on Sufism. We're really interested in that. Do you know of any Sufi groups in the city?" And I thought, well, actually, I don't. And I don't think there were at the time any groups. I think now a few have been established since 2015, but at the time, I don't think there was anything. So I shared that and said, look, I don't think I'm qualified to start a Sufi group, but I said I could certainly help with leading a Sufi book club if folks are interested. And so we got several people who expressed a pretty keen interest in that, again, from various backgrounds, which I also really appreciated. And we started really quite delightful meetings of a dinner and a sort of catch up and social discussion. And then after dinner, get the tea and move to, let's say, a living room and go through an assigned reading, essentially, that we've all spent the past month working through. And so when they asked for a suggestion of a book that we might start with, I thought, well, let's dive into the deepest possible end of the pool and go with the Gemstones of Wisdom. And so I think for some of them who had some awareness of what the text was like, there was a bit of trepidation, but it proved to be, I think, such a good choice, because really the beauty of a book like the Gemstones is it really does force a kind of grappling with, marinating within, and even when we didn't understand passages or themes that we were engaging with, which I think is inevitable with a text like the Gemstones, there were such fruitful conversations that emerged out of that kind of wrestling with the text and really trying to engage it. I think because it is challenging. So we spent a few years actually. Each month we would go through a chapter, and as years went on, would sometimes go back and relook at chapters. And that, I think, also really helped with this book dissolving into being, because we spent all of this time in engaging and discussing and, I think kind of bringing it to life in a sense. And so some of the writing of the book actually arose fairly organically out of that. I think the really the first chapter that I wrote in the book, it's not chronologically ordered, but was the chapter on Moses, on Musa. And when I was reading that and kind of being struck by certain patterns in the chapter, I immediately started, writing those down. And I should say too, in speaking of the genesis of the book, I do have to give some credit to my former PhD supervisor and now co-author and collaborator, Professor Mina Sharifi Funk, who, when I told her, yeah, so I've been working through this chapter on Moses and I started writing some things, and she also suggested, oh, wouldn't it be kind of interesting to have a whole book that does that has a kind of contemporary engagement with the Gemstones of Wisdom, and I felt like quite inspired or excited by that idea. So definitely that Sufi book club, our little humble dinner and book discussion club played a role in the book for sure. Yeah.
And you mentioned that the Moses chapter was the one that you started off with.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about that particular chapter that grabbed you or made you choose it out of all the ones that were there?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have people from a Jewish background that were present in the club, or was it just something else about the chapter that was the way in?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think in this particular case, certainly having Jewish members of our Sufi book club, I think that was helpful in various aspects of the book. Actually, in the chapter on Jesus too, I was realizing when I was working through often Christian sources that there's this sense that Jesus represents kind of the spirit, and then you have the Pharisees, kind of the proto-rabbinical tradition representing the law, and some of my Jewish members of the club who were also academics were pointing out that Jesus was also drawing upon very classically Jewish themes or themes from the Torah, and so I think that was particularly helpful. But when it comes to the chapter on Moses, really I think what I was struck by was this sort of shared theme of the often quite surprising contradiction between appearances and underlying realities. And really, he spends a lot of time in that chapter focused on the story of Musa and Khidr, the green one, the verdant green figure, the immortal Khidr, and how the appearances of Khidr's actions are so powerfully contradicted by the realities that are unfolding, we might say, underneath or behind them. And then really noticing that theme throughout the entire chapter, also talking about Moses and the killing of these infants as if they were Moses, which again on the surface is an complete atrocity, but underneath that some much more powerful plan of spiritual power and liberation is unfolding. And so I was really struck by that repeated theme of this contradiction between appearance and reality. And even Ibn Arabi in that chapter talking about how the power of youth or infants over adults, the power of the weaker over the stronger. Again, this wonderful contradiction between appearance and reality that I think is something that you really see emphasized in various mystical esoteric traditions, but I think Ibn Arabi really illustrates it so well. So that was really, I think, the doorway into wanting to kind of unpack that and write about that, try to articulate that again in a almost conversational way. And that, I think, really was when I started writing the book.
You mentioned the conversational style that you ended up with, which is very strong, I think, in the book. Was it, I mean, it was clearly a deliberate choice. Who did you have in
Yes.
mind as a potential audience? You mentioned your brother,
Mm-hmm.
who kind of instigated this writing in a way by asking
Yes.
for a recommendation. Has he read it? So what does he make of it? Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to put him on the spot and ask just yet. He does have a copy of the book, but I don't want to go to professor mode and be like, so have you been doing your readings lately? But actually, I can say it was really kind of special, and I really do have to again thank you, Stephen, for all of your help in bringing this book forth and really deeply valuable feedback and advice on it. But it was really special for me. About 2 weeks ago, I was visiting my parents on the west coast of Canada, and they both had copies of the book and were reading through it and asking me questions as they went. And that was partly, I think, what I really hoped for is my brother, parents, friends. What I study is not always super intelligible to folks without some familiarity with the subject. It can seem a bit arcane and so there was also this desire to say, well, I'd love to produce something that I can give to, again, people who themselves are readers and interested, generally speaking, and we might say nonfiction subjects. I imagine if you didn't have any kind of interest in that sort of reading, the book wouldn't have any appeal. But being able to give that to them and then have them engage it and get into conversation about it. I mean, I think that's been really special. So, at the same time, though, I think there are really two audiences for the book, and so I really appreciate the question. On one level, it's definitely written for interested readers who don't have a background necessarily in Islamic intellectual traditions or Sufi philosophy. So it is meant to be a doorway into the subject, kind of an introductory work. But at the same time, as somebody who works in the academic world, I wanted to make sure that it was grounded in scholarship and it was grounded in engaging both the Fusus itself and the now fairly extensive secondary literature. And so it was really, and I guess time will tell how successful it was, but it was really an attempt to try to engage both of those audiences, and have something for folks who are in the specialist or scholarly world, who can still get something out of it, but again also make it accessible for people who might not come from that background.
well, I mean, I think I think you've succeeded very well, but let's see, the audience will tell us one day. I wanted to ask you something about, you mentioned the octave and the 8 chapters that you chose, basically eight prophetic figures and how they're treated in the Fusus and using them as samples. What are you able to say any more about what made you choose those particular 8?
Yeah, yeah, no, I would love to. I think it's a really helpful question to get into the book. And so, yeah, I mean, I can almost go in order a little bit. So as I said, I started with the chapter on Moses and really being struck by this kind of pattern of the, in some cases, quite shocking or remarkable contrast between the way that things appear and the way that they really are. And so after that, I started, and after speaking with Professor Sharifi Funk and the question of my brother and the book club, I started thinking, okay, let me go through the gemstones again with an eye to which chapters I'm going to want to engage more deeply. And for sure, the chapter on Adam for me was an obvious choice, and I think that was the next one that I would have wrote, the next chapter I wrote, in part because it really offers this sense of the foundations, or I guess in Arabic, the usul of the Sufi philosophical tradition. You're getting into this question of being and the human being, the significance and purpose of the human being, the vastness of human nature, and its universality or perfectibility. So, and that's always been one of my favorite chapters in the book. I just find it has such a profundity and clarity. So definitely the chapter on Adam, I felt was really where I wanted to go next. And then I think after that, as I was working through the text, the chapter on Shu'aib jumped out to me as well, particularly with maybe something a little bit similar in terms of the vastness of human potential and really the vastness of the human heart. And I also, one of the ways that I approached the Fusus was also thinking about which passages, which themes allow me to introduce the larger Islamic Sufi tradition to folks who, again, might not have a background in it. And I should say too on this, Stephen, that maybe another audience is like the seeker set in the West. People who are engaged in looking for a mystical practice, a spiritual practice, and they've gone to Buddhist groups or yoga or Sufi groups, and people who have that kind of interest. I thought there's so much within the Islamic Sufi tradition that just isn't as well known. I feel like sort of certain Buddhist traditions and yoga traditions have got a more mainstream hearing in the West, and I think that there's still room for us who work in this field to help disseminate what really I think is a rich offering from the Islamic Sufi tradition on some similar themes. So this idea of the heart, the self, the spirit, right, the whole human being. We could say Sufi psychology. I felt like the chapter on Shu'aib allowed me to delve into some of that a bit more. And then I think after that, it was the chapter on Yunus or Jonah. Again, some really cool themes that I think Ibn Arabi addresses so well there. First, this question of conflict and vengeance. And that allowed me to talk also about jihad, which, again, so misunderstood in Western context and sensationalized. And I think Ibn Arabi really articulates an Islamic humanism, such a humanistic sense of the value, the inestimable value of human life, and really the obligation of humans to preserve and protect it whenever possible. And I thought, yeah, that's something that is really useful to highlight, especially for people who might not be too familiar with the Islamic tradition. And I also loved how then he moves to talk about dhikr, the remembrance of God. So, I can talk about some Sufi practice or methodology there. And then finally, the afterlife, and really just love how Ibn Arabi discusses the afterlife. I mean, even just that, when he writes that the next life is essentially an externalization of your soul, your heart. Your internal becomes external. I mean, it's just such, I think, a wonderful key to making sense of that mystery. So then I moved to, and again, kind of, I guess, sharing how I wrote them chronologically. This isn't necessarily the order in the book, but so after, Moses and then Adam, Shu'aib, I got into the chapter on Abraham, Ibrahim, and really I was caught by how really universal this sense of the problem or mystery, the intractable mystery of destiny. And I wrote about it as sort of karma in the Indian traditions and destiny in what we might call the Abrahamic traditions, but the shared sense of it being one of the greatest mysteries in life. And so I thought that was a really fascinating theme to dive into. And of course, Ibn Arabi has such I think, a fascinating take on that question. So I really wanted to get into that. And then it was, there were 3 more chapters that I wrote, and I wrote all those last, and that was in order: the chapter on Elijah/Enoch, the chapter on Jesus, and then finally the chapter on Muhammad. And I felt it was appropriate because that is the last chapter in the Gemstones, but also just in terms of the Sufi tradition to conclude with a chapter on Muhammad. And in each of those chapters, again, just so many directions one could go, but I chose in the chapter on Elijah Enoch to really focus on this question of knowledge and the spectrum of knowledge that I think the Sufi tradition and Ibn Arabi articulate in such a sophisticated way, and still so helpful. I think there's great value in people today, because we seem to have forgotten it, that the human being has multiple faculties of knowing. We've got our senses that can give us knowledge of the physical world, but we also have internal faculties, and really the faculty of the soul or the heart, which allows knowledge of realities that we might call transcendent, which again is in so many contexts totally forgotten. So articulating that breakdown of these faculties of knowledge, I thought was really helpful. And then in the chapter on Jesus, starting with this mind-body problem, which when I've studied and taught philosophy, I found so interesting. And I also love how just completely unsolvable it seems to be. Decades and decades of a lot of money, a lot of research, a lot of scientific advancement, and still a fundamental, well, we don't really have much of a clue of how the mind and the body interact. So I thought that was really interesting. And again, it connects with Jesus as this figure joining spirit and body. Again, understood differently in Christianity and Islam, but some shared themes. And then in that chapter, I also realized that this whole question of not only spirit body, but spirit and law, this question of, you could say, Sufism and sharia was one that I felt could really be discussed there. And of course, Ibn Arabi is somebody who wrote so extensively on, we might say, a kind of spiritualized understanding of the sharia. So, and then from there, moving to the chapter on Muhammad. And what I really loved there was the way that Ibn Arabi focused on what I started to kind of call this Mohammedan paradigm, which really is seeing the spiritual or encountering the spiritual everywhere, and also in the sensual. And I think at times in human history, in various cultures and societies, there's this, division or dichotomy between the sensual and the spiritual, which I think can have all kinds of problems, can lead to all kinds of problems, culturally, individually, etc. And so I really think there's this kind of beautiful marriage of sense and soul in the Mohammedan paradigm that Ibn Arabi articulates so fully in the Gemstones when looking at, experiencing the real, experiencing God through sensuality, romance, the senses, particularly smell, which I found to be really fascinating the more I got into that. And then also embodied devotional action, like prayer. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, I think, kind of, that's a bit of a summary of those chapters and what drew me to each of them. And I could probably say more, but maybe I'll leave it there for now.
That's a great summary. I'm sure that maybe there will be questions about individual chapters or the whole book. One thing I wanted to ask you before we start opening it out for others is I wonder when you think of Ibn Arabi's teaching in the modern world, how would you see it in terms of somebody who's seeking? In other words, what kind of remedy does Ibn Arabi's teaching have?
Yeah.
For not so much the world today, but the illness of being human, if I can put it like that,
Yeah.
in the sense of the difficulties we face as human beings and how to best deal with them.
Mm.
What is it that Ibn Arabi brings to the table, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an incredible question, and there are so many ways that one can answer that, which you know much better than I do. But a few things come to mind. I mean, on one level, I would say the vastness of human potential. I find there's such an inspiring, we might say, anthropology, to an inspiring view of the human, an understanding of the human being as having this absolutely radical potential for realizing, the most subtle, profound, beautiful qualities in the cosmos, and manifesting those in a balanced way that can bring so much healing to the world. So I think just even that sense of what the human being really is, what it means to be created in the image of God, and in a sort of practical way, the possibility of manifesting these beautiful names and qualities of the real. I mean, I think there's such an inspiration there, and that has value for people perennially in any time. In our time in particular, I think we are really, there's a real danger now with this kind of overload of information, but lack of ability to sort and make sense of information. And so I think we're seeing a proliferation of bad philosophy, basically, extremely narrow, extremely narrow. We're seeing these sort of extremisms or hyper-nationalisms and these kind of allergies to allergic reactions to this global awareness that's developing. And I think Ibn al-Arabi offers such a beautiful way of making sense of particularity. Not abandoning particularity, recognizing the unique value of each particular perspective, but also recognizing its inherent limitations, right? So as Mina Sharifi Funk would often say to me, appreciating the perfections and limitations of every possible human perspective and religion and ideology and belief and all these things. And so, I mean, I think there's something of a remedy there, or at least one possible remedy for what really seems to be an increasing issue for people is how to make sense of this diversity of the world in a way that can honor, the particular, not just trying to dissolve it into maybe a false universal, but to honor the particular, but also realizing that it is always a limited take on a much larger reality. So some kind of, I think, really profound integration of unity and diversity, which is the one in the many, right? It's this perennial philosophical issue, as the Greek philosophers well knew, but one that is not often, I think, dealt with very well. And so, yeah, a few thoughts on that anyways.
Lovely. Thank you, Rory. Now we've got a couple of questions from Kris. I know she's been storing them up for you. These are a couple of mystery questions from Kris.
Amazing. Yeah.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Stephen. I like the quotable quotes from you. That it's like making sense of particularity and also honoring it and acknowledging its limitation. I think it's really wonderful because this is where also the angle I'm kind of taking when I hold your book, but specifically, and one aspect of particularity that's kind of honoring it is this. What I find beautiful, there's a lot of beautiful stuff that you do. It's an eloquent book that you write, Rory, but one of the beautiful things is that you connect Ibn Arabi teachings on what it means to be human with voices across centuries and continents. And I share with Stephen, I was so delightedly surprised when I opened the book, page 82, I saw you quote the one person that I'm reading and studying now, and which come from my background, Hamza Fansuri poem.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a beautifully titled chapter. The first chapter is on Adam. What does it mean to be human? And I was so excited. I kind of wrote to Stephen, and I said, what I wanted to share with you is that in Southeast Asia, an island Southeast Asia where I come from, we call Hamza Fansuri the Malay Ibn Arabi, because he played a key role in spreading the teachings of the Shaykh al-Akbar in the region. So for those who have not read the book, I will read the quatrain, which Rory quoted on page 82, but I tweak it a bit. So it's in the old time it would be sung in the tradition, but
okay.
But I wouldn't be able to sing, so I would read it. So basically, the quatrain was the last four. I would say the great ocean is without a shore, majesty and beauty everywhere. Plunge not from your left side. Know well how to conduct yourself. And so this ocean without a shore, most of us here are familiar with this brilliant book by Michel Chodkiewicz on Ibn Arabi and Ocean Without a Shore. So it's literally that's what Hamza Fansuri wrote. But what I wanted to pay attention to kind of go into with Rory today to share with us is the last two lines where he said, plunge not from the left side. So Hamza Fansuri was, he's a true Akbarian, and he quoted Ibn Arabi, and he talked about the left side because he was referencing the Quranic verses on the right side. There are like 3 verses in the Quran. On Moses, also about where he talks about God calling Moses and God giving guidance. And another verses in Al-Waqi'ah, I think, it talks about the right, from the right side is to be among the virtuous, those who stand upright. And what my question to you to pose to you to share with us from your book is about this last line from the quatrain, where Hamza Fansuri talked about know well how to conduct yourself. So, Rory, can you speak about the role of right conduct, ethical conduct? So we started talking about that to live in this current world. in this journey, because this whole book that you write is a journey for everyone taking up the book, students of Ibn Arabi or any Sheikh in a Sufi path and a mystical path. It's a journey of self-realization. So you talk about that, and also kind of within the context of the diversity of these teachings. So for me, it is Ibn Arabi, 13th century, from Andalusia, goes to the east. And then for me personally, Hamza Fansuri in the 16th century, in my part of the world. And now today, we're gathering today, 21st century, and we all come from different parts, different aspects of a different part of the world and different time zone and so on. So with this idea of this right conduct, and share with us, and how might this idea help us navigate our shared humanity across cultures and time? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you kindly, Kris. That's great. Yeah, and I really appreciate that you noticed that Fansuri quote. I mean, it really is just absolutely beautiful poetry. I was really struck by how much meaning was in that. And I guess one of the things I've found to your question, right? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that old saying, "At-tasawwuf kulluhu al-adab." You know, all of Sufism, right? Like, you can say all you want about spiritual realization, but the real pay dirt, so to speak, is adab, which is, for those who aren't familiar with the term, you know, a really nice Arabic term that has a few meanings. I mean, it can refer to literature in a more mundane way, but really, adab in this context means a sort of a carefulness of behavior. It's sometimes translated as etiquette, but really acting kindly, with consideration of others, acting in a spirit of service, acting with, we might say, emotional intelligence, you know, reading a room, and really behaving in a fruitful, helpful, appropriate way in each moment, right? So I think, and certainly Ibn Arabi wrote, a huge amount about practice, right? And it's also, I think, an interesting question, because of course this book is dealing with the philosophical foundations, we might say, but I definitely still tried to speak about these practices, because I think within the Sufi tradition, they're absolutely inseparable. And I think that's, so it is, just generally speaking, a really important point to bring up, that Sufism is a tradition of realization, you know, making things real. And this also reminds me in the chapter on Muhammad, talking about states and stations, the hal and maqam. And again, something that I found so interesting that Sufis like Ibn Arabi and others wrote about. And incidentally, again, with the comparative piece, I found that there were various Buddhist teachers that had a very, very similar perspective. And it's a kind of avoiding or encouraging people not to get too focused on spiritual experience and states of being, right? These are passing things that come and go. And if one fixates on them, they can start to miss the point. And the idea was instead, rather than altered states, it's altered traits, as the saying goes, right? Actually, transforming oneself in who they are and how they live in daily life being the real goal and purpose. So Sufis historically have been, not that concerned with the spiritual state, the passing spiritual state, much more focused on the maqam, the actual way of being that one operates through. So.
Because thank you, I was given the privilege to kind of have two questions. Rory, now I want to look at another chapter, another chapter that kind of struck me also, because Hamza Fansuri in particular focused on this chapter in his poetry that I'm kind of studying now. But I'm continuing with the inquiry into the journey of self-realization. Yeah. So in the chapter of the Prophet Jonah, Yunus alayhi salam, that you wrote, but I'm reading it together with the Futuhat, chapter 33. There was a passage where Ibn Arabi, so chapter 33 is where Ibn Arabi discusses about observance of one's intentions, the niyat. And then you mentioned about niyat, the interior just now. You said, it's beautiful how in Yunus alayhi salam is about or even in the afterlife, the interior become the exterior. So that's what I also find fascinating in chapter 33. And then in the Futuhat. And then let me just kind of quote, I read a passage from the Futuhat. I use Shuaib Winkle's translation. So Ibn Arabi was talking about Yunus alayhi salam. He said, Then his cherisher answered him and saved him from sadness, and the whale flung him out of his insides. And an infant flashed upon sound fitrah, I'm talking about fitrah. And then Ibn Arabi said, no one from the children born of Adam is born twice except Jonah alayhi salam. And so, and then Ibn Arabi goes on to describe Jonah as being weak or sickly, quoting from the Quran, chapter 37, verse 145. And then Ibn Arabi goes into details, beautiful details, how Jonah was cherished by God under the protective God plan, and it's also described in the Fusus, an image of divine mercy, compassion, forgiveness, because as particularly Jonah is twice born. But I also wanted to kind of bring a bit the idea of intention, because before Ibn Arabi described about Jonah, he talks about mindfulness and attentiveness to our intentions. And Ibn Arabi said, no one before talked about intentions. It is so important because he said it's tying it back to attentiveness to our breaths. And I thought it was fascinating because you bring in a lot of other tradition and breathing practice is in a lot of other traditions. So Rory, what I want to do, I kind of like narrow, and now I kind of, so what I wanted in your chapter, Jonah and the wisdom of the breath, you explore several key themes. Could you share your insight on this particular one, the nature of death and what lies beyond death? And you started to talking about it just now. And if possible, if you could bring in the role of niyat, intention, as it appeared, because you did cover about it throughout the book. Thank you, and that's kind of my last question.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, I'm just thinking in that chapter on Yunus or Jonah, talking about the afterlife. I mean, yeah, fundamentally, I think before even getting into the particularities, and I also found this interesting that within the Sufi tradition as a whole, there's some diversity of understanding of the nature of the afterlife. And you know, the Quran has these very, in some cases, visceral images of what that experience is like, whether of bliss or torment. And Ibn Arabi was one who didn't really interpret those in a kind of a rationalistic or abstract way, right? I think, again, as somebody who always emphasized the importance of the imaginal, we might say. And so I found that interesting, whereas some Sufis did, in fact, interpret those in a somewhat metaphorical or even rationalistic way. But yeah, I think that in general, that notion of the states of being, the intentions that one has cultivated throughout life, manifesting as one's external when they die. I mean, whether you engage with those particularities or not, I think that's a really helpful way, especially getting back to your first question too, in relation to ethics. You know, inner and outer ethics, really, right? You know, what kind of existence is one cultivating? And yeah, the breath is fascinating. I mean, I think of, you know, the more I study the Sufi tradition in general, I think the more that the breath becomes something of focus and awareness. And actually, you know, it makes one thing that comes to mind, and I hope, Stephen, it's okay if I share this because it's something that you shared with me when we met, and I found it just so profound, and it relates to breath. And it was about the Fusus and one of, and maybe you can fill in the names. I don't recall which of the generations of students of Ibn Arabi it was, but one of them was saying to, I think it was a student of Qunawi's, but again, you can correct me, and because Qunawi had talked about the fact that how difficult it was to understand the gemstones. And despite reading it with Ibn Arabi, you know, not being able to understand, and then at some point aligning his breathing with Ibn Arabi's as he was reciting it. And at that point, comprehension occurred. And so I remember, Stephen, when you shared that anecdote with me, I thought that was a really profound commentary on the connection between the breath and, we might say, tahqiq or spiritual realization.
Yeah, just to fill in the little background for those who don't know, there was a student of Qunawi's who was called al-Jandi,
Jandi, thank you.
and he was reading the Fusus with al-Qunawi. And when they were reading the introduction, the Muqaddimah, Jandi experienced this state of his breathing becoming aligned and completely concordant with al-Qunawi's. And he says that through that concordance, the meanings of the Fusus were revealed to him in one go. And he mentions it to al-Qunawi, who says exactly the same thing happened to me when I was reading it with the Sheikh. So it's like a method of transmission through breath.
Yeah, amazing.
Anyway, thank you. Well, that's great. That's a good beginning. So what I suggest we do now is open it up for questions from the floor.
Mary asked, which edition of the Fusus did the Winnipeg Reading Club with Rory that you used? She was wanting to ask that.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. I mean, yeah, there are some interesting versions in English, and they have their own virtues and drawbacks, or perfections and limitations to use that language. The one that we used the most was this one here. The R.W.J. Austin version, which I find actually the Dagley version, this one here is I find it more clear, I think, in general. I think the language is, at least that's my own experience of it, but at the time, I think more of us had the Austin edition, which I think also has its virtues, so that's the one that we worked with, yeah.
Thanks, Rory. I think Anne Gray has her hand up. Maybe you can mute and unmute. Thanks, Anne.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. I haven't read the book yet, but I think this is arousing my curiosity. I didn't understand what you meant by the afterlife involves the internal becoming the external. Could you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can only elaborate to the best of my understanding of what Ibn Arabi meant by that, but my understanding is that the one's inner reality becomes one's outer reality after death, and so it's an externalization. I've also thought of this as almost like you live in your heart after you die, which is a sort of, and again, whether it's intention, we could say states of being, general orientation, qualities of heart manifest as one's external realm. So, really, you could think of this in terms of the Quranic imagery of, living a life of compassion and consideration and kindness and positive intention would then manifest externally in a realm that reflects these qualities, and living a life of malice and anger and hatred would similarly manifest in a realm where those qualities become manifest, experientially, we might say. So, yeah, I mean, that's maybe the best I can do. I think it's a really interesting question, though, and there's probably more that one could dive into that, but that would be my limited understanding of it.
Thank you.
So, Yasmin, maybe you can ask your question.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Oh,
I really love the title. I mean, as soon as I saw it, dissolving into being, it's there's a profoundly sensual or sensitive or there's something really powerful. It was something powerful for me anyway. And what came with that was something that I can't say that I know a huge amount of, in terms of the philosophy, more an experiential perhaps, but it's something that that you're touching on, the sort of the states and the stations, because I believe that, I think it's in the Futuhat, but Ibn Arabi wrote and spoke about the station of no station. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about the title and how that came into being and what it means for you and where you're hoping we go with that. And then if you can also expand that into, if you have any inspirations, or anybody else does for that matter, about the station of no station, which, as I said, I don't really know a huge amount about. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin, for the question. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, so the title, Dissolving into Being, part of this actually comes from working with, who again was my PhD supervisor and now collaborator, and also really mentor, I think, on the Sufi way, Professor Mina Sharifi Funk, who actually was advice she would give me when lecturing. She'd say just to totally disappear, just completely disappear, and the lecture is better because it's almost like you allow what needs to come through. And so one of the initial ideas I had was like disappearing into being. I thought maybe that would be a good title. And then I was discussing with a colleague of mine at the University of Winnipeg, Nanis Ibrahim, who said, well, I feel like dissolving is better. And I thought, okay, that is a lot better. And then some kind of alchemical echoes there too, which I really like. But I kind of think that's partly what the Sufi path is dissolving into, becoming the child of the moment, as one of the Sufi sayings goes. Dissolving into being, into the moment, and in a way that ties in with this idea of fana, or the annihilation of the self, getting self-reference out of the way so that one is existing more as I think a vessel for the qualities of the real. So I think that's one of the things that the title is intended to point to. And then the question of station of no station. Yeah, I find that such a beautiful concept of Ibn Arabi's, and I discussed it in the last chapter on Muhammad as embodying this station of no station, which I really like how Ibn Arabi writes about it, is kind of including every possible station, integrating every possible human expression, but ultimately going totally beyond them, being without goal, just a sort of, I also connected it with the Buddhist gate gate parasam gate, gone, totally gone beyond, right? So this sense of a kind of a pure transcendence. That also what I love about Ibn Arabi's articulation of the station without station is this kind of pure transcendence that's also integrated in a very ordinary everyday life, and a very kind of natural, organic way of being. And so I thought that was something very, very profound, and tried to articulate that somewhat in the last chapter on Muhammad. But thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. And Richard, you have your hand up.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you very much for putting this presentation on. We've actually bought the book. I was thinking, why have we bought this book? So now I know. Thank you. That's very helpful. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I think it sort of seems to be addressing a need to actually just go and put these ideas into a wider context, and the sort of conversations that are going on in the world today. So thank you very much. I think it's a great, sounds like a great contribution. I'm sort of quite interested in the dynamics between Anqa and yourself, and how this, because this is a book launch, so I can ask this sort of question, how this project came into being, how it developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, basically, as I mentioned before, in writing this book, I felt like there was something of an unconventionality to it, right? Taking things that are normally written about in fairly strictly academic or technical scholarly ways, and which again, still wanting to maintain that at root or base, but also putting it into a more conversational format. And so I had shopped the book around a little bit, and in some cases the response was, this is a bit maybe unconventional. But I think Stephen quite kindly took to it and really offered, and I really do want to say this, a really truly amazing advice that I think helped me refine the book. I'm coming from even though I started studying Ibn Arabi in grad school, I pretty soon shifted to studying contemporary or lived Sufism. And so I think Stephen was really instrumental in helping me really cross the T's and dot the I's in terms of some of the technical aspects of the work and translation. And so that was really invaluable. So I feel genuinely grateful that the book is with Anqa in part because of, I think, the benefit the book received through going through that process of working with Stephen to get it to where it's at now. So, yeah.
Thank you. Stephen, have you got anything to say?
Rory's being very kind, but the main thing is, as you can tell from the way he's talking, is the passion he has for the subject matter. And that shone through from the first reading. So, you know, those who've been studying Ibn Arabi for a long, long time, maybe we can have a little bit to offer, but what we can't do anything about is to instigate the passion that somebody has for the love for the subject, and that shines through the book very much, and especially for me, I think it was refreshing to read something in a conversational style as opposed to something in a more technical, let's say, sense. So it's been a pleasure to work with Rory.
Rory, you talked about an emerging sensibility, a spiritual sensibility in the world. I haven't got the phrase completely correct, so I didn't write it down, but something like that. And then the corresponding extreme reaction of people to that broadening. And so I took note of that. But you also talked about a spiritualized sharia. So sharia can be very controversial. Could you expand a little bit on that phrase? Because you did use that phrase, spiritualized sharia. So how would you address that to somebody who, would ask about that and want to know more about it?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. And I'll try to focus the answer again. There's a few different ways one could go with that. So one of the things that I noticed in my study of Sufism, both contemporary and classical, was that there is a very interesting spectrum of approaches among Sufis to this question of sharia. And unfortunately, you often get a kind of a dichotomy that happens when people think about this. And this can be either imagining that Sufism and Sharia are in a kind of perpetual opposition to one another. Again, this is that spirit law dichotomy that I wrote about in the chapter on Jesus, in part because, again, as a figure who is sometimes positioned as this kind of, spirit versus law figure. And so I thought it was important to dive into that and really also to talk about this fact that there is this spectrum. And although some Sufis, and at the same time, though, you can also get some folks who are coming from more embedded within the Islamic tradition who will want to simply limit Sufism to living the Sharia in its deepest way, which is of course a really important expression of Sufism, without doubt, but not the only one. And that's what I found historically, and what I wanted to do in that chapter was give a little bit of space to discuss that range of approaches that Sufis have taken. Where you have had the Qalandars, who have largely rejected outward Islamic norms and practices quite ostentatiously, really purposefully doing that in some cases to make a point about the hypocrisy of fixations on outward forms and things. But I would say that's probably not the majority. By far, that's not the majority approach, although it is one that has had some really, I think, profound expressions historically. But then, of course, you get the approach to Sharia among Sufis that sees it as a stepping stone, that sees it really as a kind of moral foundation or basis. And really, I think some kind of it's partly how do you define Sharia? If you define Sharia as simply how it manifested in terms of fiqh, in terms of the Islamic jurisprudential tradition that really crystallized in the 9, 10, 1100s. I think that's certainly one way to approach Sharia, and some Sufis do. Some Sufis would see following a school of law, a madhab, is being really important, and that actually Sufism would be inseparable from this very, very committed living of the Sharia as it manifests in the Islamic jurisprudential tradition. But then you would get Sufis, again, who see it as more of a stepping stone, as I alluded to before. I mean, Rumi was one who talked about this a lot as, you know, it's a ladder that you climb, but once you get to where you're going, you don't need the ladder anymore. So, you know, seeing it as a stage that one sort of transcends, which again, for some Sufis, they would not follow Rumi in that sense and believe that, you know, the Sharia is something that one is always deeply immersed in. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Qalandaria and other figures who, in some cases, moved fairly far away from engaging with the Islamic legal tradition. So yeah, I mean, really, when you think though of people like whether it's al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, people who did really value the Sharia and saw it as an integral part of Sufism, generally interpreted the outward acts and the outward norms and laws. And part of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah is, you know, the Meccan revelations, you know, is really a delving into the metaphysical, spiritual significance of you know, some very, in some cases, it seems like arcane details of the Sharia, of the law, you know, the numbers of things. How many times do you wash, you know, your hands before prayer or something, and looking at the significance of these and the deeper esoteric spiritual meaning of them. So that's partly what I was alluding to with this spiritualized Sharia. But even another thing I'll say on that point is, and I mentioned this in the chapter on Jesus, is you know, Ibn Arabi talked about really the importance of living both the letter and the spirit of the law, which I thought was interesting. And he said, you're actually not really living the letter of the law if you're not living the spirit of the letter as well, right? And so that often manifests as a kind of an emphasis on rahmah, on mercy, and going easy on people and finding you know, loopholes for people, essentially. I mean, maybe I'm putting it a bit facetiously, but really an orientation that the law is for people, the people aren't for the law. You know, that any kind of, we might say, whether it's a legal guideline or maybe even moral, ethical standards, you know, I would again call that like a humanistic approach, right? Realizing that these are for people. They're meant to fulfill and facilitate human life and not inhibit or repress it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rory. Yes, I think what you talked about earlier in your conversation, the idea of a conversation group where everybody comes together and can discuss it freely. And obviously they're going to be coming into line practice-wise when the meaning begins to take effect inside them. Maybe it's not automatic, but I think it happens. Thank you so much. I have read your book and I recommend it wholeheartedly to anybody.
Thank you kindly. I really appreciate that.